mean, the whole, this PR of Pakistan, that they are mediating this whole narrative of coming in, of letting coming in these players of from USA and Iran has become a mockery now. And that is what I was saying in my last understanding, that this was technically the most bizarre thing that Pakistan could have done. That what they were just the Dakia who was sending the messages from here and there, and they preached themselves as someone who was trying to put a they had a say, or they had a conclusive point in this whole conflict. But this proves that there was nothing such like that. So let's start with very basic. So in the crucible of 2026 Iran USA war, this whole conflict ignited on 28 Feb by the precision strikes that lit the Persian Gulf ablaze. So Pakistan positioned itself as an indispensable bridge that swerved the interlocutor between Washington and Tehran. But the point was, Islamabad's public relation machinery harmed him with the elegant efficiency, and that was a diplomatic renaissance that they called it, from Paria to peacemaker. So what you can see, from the shadow of past isolation to the flood hit, halls of its own capital, Shehbaz Sharif technically had the quiet architect in Rawalpindi, which was orchestrated as a masterclass in the narrative control. But the fact that they floated two-faced truce proposal, it was shuttled emissaries from kind of Riyadh to Beijing, and ultimately they hosted the historic face-to-face summit in Islamabad on 11 April. But when of course when Vice President J.D. Vance led the American delegation, Speaker Mohammad Bagar Ghalibaf anchored the Iran's, the trilateral choreography that they proclaimed initially, I feel that there was a triumph of understanding a narrative of Pakistani statecraft. But the very beneath they glided this PR veneer lay a deeper, more corrosive truth, which reveals that the perennial tragedy of middle power mediation, technically, the mediator who hedged too cleverly eventually bleeded out in credibility from both the sides. And in this case, I feel that Tehran's sense of betrayal was not technically abstract, but rather it was very surgical. It was more, I would say, it was more timed, and I would say it was very devastating at the end. And consider, I mean, let's see how technically Hormuz as the theater of duplicity, because consider the Strait of Hormuz, the juggler of this whole global energy, where 20% of the world's oil once technically flowed until Iran was into wartime fury, and they declared it close to the enemy shipping. Now, in a rare gesture of fraternal solidarity, Tehran technically granted safe passage to Pakistani flagged vessels, which was a neighborly exemption born of a kind of a shield holder Baloch kingship and the memory of the stillborn Iran-Pakistan gas pipeline, which Iran waved those ships through while they were choking at the same times of the American and Allied tankers. So what flowed was the quiet betrayal that Tehran now brands as a double game. So the news is that intelligence streams corroborated the across multiple regional resources. They said that they indicated that Islamabad either turned a blind eye, or they actively coordinated the transit of vessels whose ultimate beneficiaries were the Americans' logistic chains. So 10 ships by some tallies, oil oil supplies, perhaps even subtle naval resupply under commercial camouflage. So what they were doing is that Iran had extended the trust as a fellow Muslim state under the seas, but Pakistan, in Tehran eyes, repaid it by greasing the wheels of the very adversary it claimed to be mediating with. Now this was not a technical slip that they were pointing it out. It was a real political move in the rawest form. Pakistan eternal hedging, that was balancing its Saudi defense pact, was quite courtship of American largesse under the current administration, and its need for the IMF oxygen, which Pakistan was asking as a bheeg to this nation against the optics, against the very optics of the Islamic solidarity. Now, the Rawalpindi's calculus was very cold, keeping the state partially open for its own economic lifeline, while they were preserving just enough deniability to host the talks. But in the zero-sum logic game of wartime in Tehran, this was not the neutrality. I feel that it was a dagger of duplicity slipped between the ribs of the neighbor already, which was bleeding from the precision strikes already in Iran. So the factions within the Iranian establishment, the hardliners, IRGC voices, the clerical skeptics, they all felt this sting very acutely. So trust once fractured in the strait could not be technically reassembled in the conference rooms of Islamabad that they were trying to preach in. Now, what happened technically in the collapse of whole mediation theater? The summit itself became the final act of this tragedy, which I was saying it earlier, which was destined to become this 21 hours of marathon negotiations, direct, not merely through proximity talks, ended not with a handshake but with the delegation departing empty handed. And that was no nuclear guarantee acceptable to Washington, no sanction relief or asset freezing, unfreezing sufficient for Tehran. So there was no consensus on Hormuz reopening protocols as well, and crucially, no agreement that a fragile 2 week ceasefire must encompass the Lebanon and the Hezbollah. So a red line Iran elevated to the existential status. Even Ghalibaf publicly blamed American intransigence and kind of maximalist demands. That Vance confirmed that the proposal now rests with the Iran, that the ceasefire holds for now by a thread, but the diplomatic high wire act has snapped. So Pakistan's mediation technically and substantively failed because it rested on a foundation already which was undermined. A mediator cannot cannot broker peace when one party believes the broker has already tilted towards one board. So here Pakistan, what was trying to put forth, was technically was not preaching it. And that was the problem with America, that they were using Pakistan for this mediation because they knew that the Arab nations would not help them. So the PR symphony, headlines of Pakistan flexing the geopolitical muscles of Islamabad as the new strategy of Geneva crescended into a silence. Technically, what remained was the exposed technically architecture of Pakistan's strategy, the transactional, the multi-aligned, yet it lacked the very moral or coercive heft to compel the superpowers. And that, what I was saying, key great powers do not yield to facilitators who hedge; they technically exploit them. Now, the very deeper geopolitical reckoning in the grand continuum of this South Asian diplomacy, this episode technically echoes the very old pattern of how this diplomacy works, because Pakistan has a long played the strategic ambiguity game. They were allied to China, partner to Saudi Arabia, occasional conduit to Washington, neighbor to Iran. Yet, in the very moment of true great power friction, they kind of such ambiguity cradles into perceived perfidy. The Hormuz incident was not merely technically a maritime footnote. It was movement that Tehran concluded that Islamabad's mediation was performative theater, which was not impartial brokerage. Now, for Iran, the wound runs deeper than lost oil routes. It was a reminder of historical grievances, the stalled gas pipeline, border skirmishes in Baluchistan, and now this. So for Pakistan, the cost is subtler but no less than a grave credibility deficit that may haunt future dealings in Tehran. Even it as a pocket short-term American goodwill that they were trying to gain. So history will record technically April 2026 not as Pakistan diplomatic triumph, but as a cautionary parable in the unforgiving arithmetic of geopolitics. The mediator who back-channeled the against one principle will ultimately mediate nothing. The Silk Veil of facilitation was torn not by the American bombs or Iranian missiles, but by the quiet passage of ships through the strait, which ships that carried in Tehran's unforgiving ledger the weight of betrayal. And the weight of betrayal was on Pakistan itself. And so the curtain falls on this act, the war pauses, but the distrust was is going to be endured for a long period of time. I mean, I would again say that the trust mediation, after all, demands more than venue and press release, and that is what Pakistan and America needs to understand. It demands the consistency forged in the fire, something Islamabad in its elegant hedging could not quite deliver at their best. The game continues, but the players now know the rules Pakistan truly plays by, and that was something that Pakistan was eventually was going to be exposed of.